Good evening, everybody. Apologies for the slightly late start, but we have a great panel to make up for that, and we're going to get going straight away. The title of the evening, Cyber Snooping, in whose hands should internet governance be entrusted? I think that gives us a pretty broad range of questions. I think we're going to talk about snooping, but talk about other issues around who controls the internet, whether we're talking about democracies, transition countries, authoritarian countries, private companies, and more. So I will be introducing the panel, facilitating some of the debate, and opening it up to you as soon as possible. So with nothing more from me on the big questions for the moment, let me just introduce the panel. To my immediate left is Ian Brown. He's Associate Director at the Cyber Security Centre and Senior Research Fellow at Oxford Internet Institute. His work includes public policy issues around information in the internet, privacy, copyright, e-democracy, and a range of more technical fields, including information security and networking and healthcare informatics. Then after him, we have Karl Kathuria. I can't resist saying he only just discovered recently his surname means woodcutter in Hindi, and he is an independent media technology consultant specialising in internet distribution and streaming media. He's working in part with Psiphon, is that the right pronunciation? And he also spent 13 years at the BBC managing the distribution of World Service internet content to a global audience, including delivering news content into countries with prevalent censorship, so a wealth of experience to draw on there. Delighted to introduce to his left Birgitte Jonsdottir. It's an English pronunciation of an Icelandic name, and Birgitte is a member of the Icelandic Parliament for the Movement and chairperson of the International Modern Media Institution. She's worked as a volunteer for WikiLeaks, Saving Iceland, Friends of Tibet in Iceland, and has been an activist writer, the first Icelandic woman to work as a web developer and publisher. Jacob Appelbaum, last but not least, is, in his own words, I think, an accomplished photographer, software hacker, and world traveller. He works as a developer for the Tor project. I'm sure that's going to come up this evening. And he trains interested parties globally how to use and contribute to the Tor network, a founding member of the Hack Lab, Noisebridge in San Francisco, and a driving force in the team behind the creation of the cold boot attacks, winning, I can't pronounce this one, is the Pwini for Most Innovative Research Award. Is that a misprint, or that's something I don't understand? And
you have to read all of it.
I'm not reading all of it. And the Eugenic Security Best Student Paper Award in 2008. If the hashtag for the evening is up there, FCBBCA, so do use it. I'm going to start with asking each of the panel to do about 3 or 4 minutes on this broad theme. So we'll have a bit of an introductory set of presentations, and I will pick up a few questions from the panel and then rapidly throw it open to you. So I think I'm just going to go in the order I just introduced people. So Ian, over to you for your 3 to 4 minutes. Please.
Thanks, Kirsty. I will just be very brief, and I'll try to perhaps look at the governance piece before we move into more specific discussions of snooping and other issues. In asking who governs the internet, I think it's helpful to be clear, well, what are we talking about? The internet is rather an amorphous term. So are we talking about the existing intergovernmental institutions like the United Nations? Certainly they have become increasingly interested in people's behavior on the internet, particularly one part of the UN called the International Telecommunication Union that's existed since the 19th century to regulate international, at first telegraphy and then telephony through the 20th century. Are we talking about brand new institutions? In particular, ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which runs the international domain name system, the thing that turns bbc.co.uk into a numeric address. That is a genuinely new, genuinely international facing, although in a legal sense, actually, it's a Californian non-profit corporation operating pretty much under the control of the US government, which is quite upsetting to some other democracies and non-democracies, particularly Brazil, has protested a lot about this. Is it fair that this one, yes, powerful country, the US, should have such say over something which is a global resource, the domain name system? And of course, since so many large internet companies, the Googles, the Facebooks and so on, the Twitters that are becoming increasingly important in internet governance debates, are headquartered in the US, or at the very least have significant exposure to the US, and US law and case law has very firmly said that the behavior of companies with, not even just US headquartered companies, but with any assets exposed to the US, had better watch out when it comes to their behavior elsewhere in the world, because there are a number of US laws that have been applied to the behavior of these companies elsewhere in the world. I think that focus, the trying to be specific as we discuss through the evening these different topics like snooping, really helps to clarify where the power is and how things might be changed. And one final thing I want to say on that is that often discussions of internet governance sort of lapse by default into a group of very right-on people, I include myself in that, saying, well, isn't the internet a wonderful thing for free speech? Wouldn't it be wonderful if effectively the internet just extended the First Amendment to the rest of the world? Because the First Amendment is perfect and nobody else has anything democratic to say whatsoever about free speech, which of course, if you are a genuine Democrat, you don't actually think that. There is some room for national sovereignty in internet governance. The tricky thing comes in once you get into issues which it is genuinely hard to solve at a national level. So once you get things like the Communications Data Bill in the UK, which if passed would force UK internet service providers potentially to snoop on all of the traffic flowing backwards and forwards to companies like Google, to make records of who's talking to whom on UK soil, regardless of where the company and their servers in the world were located. So that's all I wanted to start with.
Okay, I think we'll go straight on to you then, Karl.
Okay, thanks.
Your 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay, I think, obviously any discussion around governance of the internet has to take into account the existing norms and has to take into account issues around universal freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of access to the internet. And as Ian mentioned, with the ITU proposing changes, I think it's pretty obvious that the internet has grown in a different way to telecommunications. Telecommunication networks were largely state-owned, and to be able to talk across international boundaries, obviously you needed to sort of cross those borders, which is where the ITU regulations came into place. The internet, though, obviously is built on principles of free and open access, and it has more stakeholders. It's not just governments, it is also civic society, it's individuals, it's private companies and entities. So the early debates around the regulation of the internet centred on the argument that geographical-based legal regulations didn't apply. And I know that Birgitta earlier this year blogged about a piece by John Perry Barlow called The Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. And in that he was talking about how this is a social network, how it's grown through nature rather than anything else. But I think that apart from the openness of the internet, the principles on which it was founded, there's also been a growth in censorship of content, and not just from authoritarian governments either. The Freedom House report, Freedom on the Net, that came out a month or so ago, actually said that in 20 of the 47 countries that it monitors had seen a negative trajectory in internet freedom. And freedom of access, freedom of expression on the internet is something that affects everyone. Sergey Brin spoke about that in a piece in The Guardian earlier this year called The Battle for the Internet. And he said, today the primary threat by far to internet freedom is government filtering of political dissent. He also said this has been far more effective than he could ever have imagined possible across a number of nations. So I think protection of free speech and access is actually fundamental when discussing issues of governance. With governments increasingly sort of acting to shape and control communications. As Kirsty mentioned, I worked for a number of years at the BBC, And during that time, I was responsible for trying to get BBC Chinese and Farsi language content into Iran and China, and had to look for ways of getting that information in. What I actually found when trying to do that was that people were still able to get access to that content anyway, and people were looking for ways to do that. So there's a whole community of people out there that are using tools like Tor, like Psiphon, to actually get this content. And it's not just activists that are doing this, it's the average everyday people who want access to news content or access to social media networks who are reaching out and trying to get content across the censored internet. So I think really, you know, governing the internet needs to take that into account. It's a multi-stakeholder approach that's needed. It's got to be basically sort of decentralized. In the way that the internet has grown, I see sort of internet governance as being a multi-stakeholder approach. From governments need to be involved, as do private corporations, as do civic society, as do individuals, all of whom have a stake in a free and open internet that crosses the not just geographical borders, but cross-discipline borders, multilingual borders, and so on.
Thank you. And why do you think it's got worse? You quoted the Freedom House, 20 out of 47, the trajectory is in the wrong direction.
I think that there are lots of different regulations that have been put in at a national level that are coming into force. There's lots of, there's much more access to the internet to begin with, and nation states and regulators are finding that more difficult to control. If they need to control it, they feel a need to control it, and the blocking of content is just becoming more prevalent.
And maybe more irresistible to governments. Birgitte, your take on all this?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that, of course, the internet is, like you said when we were chatting, it's grassroots up. And having lived there and had my residency there for a long time and actually spent more time online than anywhere else in the offline world, I feel it is it's impossible to govern unless we will lose everything what makes the internet important. And like if we want to go into these, I mean, there's endless stakeholder meetings. I don't know how many meetings I've been to where their stakeholders are and they're all speaking different languages. And what I worry is that there is this industrialization of the internet, and the corporations, the large media corporations and the content corporations have managed to set a really bad example by building walls between countries. And because it's so sneaky, it's just like the Iran wall, there is no difference. And it wasn't until quite recently I understood how much damage had been done online by the copyright corporations. So there is a huge need for copyright reform, and like we just experienced this so intensively when we were battling against ACTA, and all these endless monsters, legal monsters, not written by the people that are using the internet, but the stakeholders that are usually defined as the corporations or governments. So if we want to think of it, you know, in this sort of global context, then shouldn't we then have like a global Freedom of Information Act where we could get everything about, for example, us, all information that's stored by governments around the world about us? It's impossible. You know, we just have to face it. It is impossible to do it unless we destroy the internet as it is. I think we need to address these issues locally and have strong laws to protect content. You know, have strong laws to protect, for example, our historical records online, and whistleblowers and source protection. And we can't do that with data retention. It's impossible. So I think, you know, we can look at, you know, the UN and, you know, put into the UN Charter for Human Rights something that would say, you know, our privacy online. But, you know, would internet governance change anything in Iran? Would it actually help me protect and look after my back when the US government reaches up into the cloud and pulls out all my private data because I am under a suspicion of something that I don't even know what, just because I was a volunteer for WikiLeaks? I don't really think so. So I think that we just do a lot of talking about it, and at the same time our rights are dwindling away every day. So maybe we just need to start to look at it differently.
And how pessimistic or optimistic are you? You just said our rights are being whittled away every day. You know, where are we now? And you know, if 10 is perfect freedom and 0 is sort of the destruction of the internet you were talking about, how bad is it already?
I think I have such deep faith in human beings, and you know, like just this weekend. We had a national referendum on a new constitution, and I think that I was the most optimistic about the turnout and how many people would say yes to it, and I was actually right. I could have made so much money if there was betting on it. And if people are informed, you know, and then they can do amazing things. So that's why I fight for freedom of information. I think it's so critical that people are not as stupid as we think they are. And we have to trust them. And we just had like, I don't know, you know, most of you probably don't know, but I've, with other people taking the US government to court because of an addition to a law called NDAA. And the media is refusing to write about this in the United States in particular. And also in Europe, I see very little mainstream coverage of it. And yet it will actually impact everybody that's a member of this club, because it basically means that the US military can now arrest anybody anywhere on the suspicion of terrorism and put them into detention for the remaining days without access to court or a lawyer. So we actually did like a massive Twitter bomb last night. Just people from all over the world did a Twitter bomb on the debates. So it was actually forced into the presidential debates. So, you know, I think that, you know, the more we are attacked and the more we are intimidated, the masses online will resist it. And because we connect, I still have quite a good, you know.
Right. And when it was forced into the presidential debate, what did you think of the answers, briefly?
I didn't see them. I just saw it before I jumped on the flight this morning, that we managed to get it into the debate. So, you know, probably it was very superficial.
Okay. Jacob.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not a very controversially or adversarial positioned panel.
We can make it more so as we go along.
Well, I'll do my best. So the thing is that I think we have to look at it in a non-technical sense, and maybe that seems sort of surprising as a developer of Tor, but I think technology is not actually the interesting thing. What we're actually talking about is a very small piece of a thing that is a trend across the world, which is essentially the rise of fascism again. We see this with the Golden Dawn in Greece, and we see this with, for example, the NDAA case that Birgitta is fighting in. I'm actually trying to join it. I don't know if they'll let me in.
Oh, we will.
But we also see this with the NSA warrantless wiretapping. We see this with what happened to Kim.com in New Zealand, where their equivalent of the GCHQ was spying on him, despite the fact that he's actually not someone who is legitimately able to be targeted by a spy agency, which is really a novel idea, that there is such a thing as people that are not allowed to be spied on. And you know, if we look at John Kirikou, for example, in the United States, he's the only person, to my knowledge, that is going to be prosecuted for CIA torture. That sounds great, right? Well, the problem is he's the guy that blew the whistle about the CIA torturing people. So what we see is a massive expansion of authoritarianism across the globe, even in so-called free countries, so-called democracies. Well, my country certainly does not represent me when it does a targeted assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki, a US citizen in Yemen, without a trial, or when his father attempted to have standing in court to stop the government from assassinating his son in Yemen. The court refused to grant him standing, and 2 weeks after he was killed by a flying robot, also known as a drone, his son, who was 16 years old and born in Denver, was also killed by another drone at a memorial wake, I believe, for his father's death, well, with his grandparents in Yemen. And originally, the US government asserted, like the cowards that they are, that he was a terrorist, because of course he's brown and in Yemen, and is dead, so he can't defend himself. And if we look at this, what we see is that with a lot of pressure, they actually did say that actually he wasn't a terrorist, and whoops, we did kill an American child. And that isn't to say that American exceptionalism is something we should embrace, and that somehow Americans in Yemen deserve special protection, but rather the mere fact that it has gone so far, and the American government has become so brazen, that is an incredibly bad sign, because in a lot of ways the US has led the world. So when we talk about the data communications bill in the UK, it is my understanding that what this seeks to do is to legalize what is already happening. And to that end, I think that we have to consider this as an authoritarian expansionist movement across the whole globe, because it is possible for it to happen. Because we're using new technologies where people will use their politically opportunistic positions to be able to push for things to expand their powers, especially where people don't understand it or they're disempowered. I mean, it is clearly illegal to assassinate people in the way that my government is doing it in sovereign territories. And in fact, it was even illegal in the United States by the president himself saying so. So these things, they actually all tie together, because what is surveillance? It is a support system for violence. And what is censorship? It is a second-order effect of that surveillance. And it is a thing that is a violation of our basic human rights. It violates our dignity to be surveilled, because freedom from suspicion is part of what is a necessity for feeling free, in fact. So we should look at Facebook as a Stasi book and think of, we should look at it instead of talking about it as human data, we should consider it human data trafficking, because that's really what they do. And we should consider that it is not a problem of over theristan, but actually it's everywhere, all at once. For example, Osman Kibor just produced a report in the Dagsnagslivet or something like that in Norway today. I forget how to pronounce that because my Norwegian is worse than my English. And it's about Telenor, the state telecom, actually exporting to the dictatorship belt all of the surveillance capabilities for Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and a number of other stands, over theristan, if you will. And it details it, 15 pages, about state-run Norwegian telecom working with dictatorships for total surveillance to be used in support of political oppression. So these things, they're all happening together. And, I suppose, to close, I think that we have to look at things like this telephone as an example of how bad things are, or good, I suppose, for resistance. But this telephone costs about 20 British pounds. Is that about right, you think?
Yes.
Something like that. And this cable costs about 10 British pounds. It's an expensive cable. And what it allows you to do when you plug it into your computer is it allows you to intercept GSM telephone communications. It's also a regular GSM telephone. Just so happens, nothing special. You don't need to be some kind of computer wizard to deal with it. And the reason that this works is that so that the GCHQ and the Met Police and the FBI can intercept calls, all of us must be vulnerable. So for the few legitimate targets they may have, allegedly, all of us are left vulnerable to 20 or 30 British pounds worth of equipment. And that's when it's actually pretty good stuff, because it turns out it's much worse in a lot of places. And so we have a perverse incentive where the people that are supposed to keep us safe, in theory, legitimately, in theory, are actually putting us in harm's way. And they're using technological developments, and they're pretending that they had these expansions to begin with. And that's something to me that's quite scary. And it is something we have never seen in the history of humanity before. Everybody here that has a cell phone, if you could raise your hand, I think that would be fantastic. Now, keep your hand up if you have a tracking device. Everybody that put your hand down, think about what that cell phone really is and the data trail it leaves behind. What is data retention? Data retention is spying on you, where you, in many cases, are the spy. And you spying on your friends, right? Stasi book, you report on your friends to get laid, right? So we have to look at these things in the social context as much as the technological context. And I think the solution is mutual aid and solidarity in the spirit of Emma Goldman. And I think it is incredibly important to consider that when we have this kind of solidarity, we need to use strong mathematics in the place where once it was violence. The state uses violence to derive its actual consent. And we can use math in places where violence cannot be applied. And to do this, we can end dragnet surveillance. We can make secure communications systems. We can make communication devices that aren't merely tracking devices. And to do this, we need to talk about the real data. So when the four horsemen of the infopocalypse are brought out, child pornography, terrorism, the war on some drugs, and money laundering, we can actually decide how many of those things are worth shredding our civil liberties. And in the few places where we have a democracy, we can try to keep it. And if we don't, I think we don't have much of a future. So I'm the optimist on the panel.
Very clearly. Thanks very much, Jacob. I'm just going to sort of put a couple of questions to the panel and then throw it open. Picking up from where you just ended, Jacob, just a quick replies to. Should we be more concerned about democracies than authoritarian states, or are they all the same, or is it a different set of issues by each? Ian?
Well, no, of course, the torturing repressive regimes of the former Soviet Union are far more repugnant and repulsive and damaging to their citizens than the democracies are. That's not to contradict anything that Jake just said, but
in terms of what they're doing to the internet and their internet
well,
censorship,
they're perhaps not as well placed as the US to affect the technologies of the internet. They are, as Jake just said, they're importing the technologies they need from Western companies that are happy to sell it to them. And what particularly dismays me is to see, for example, Carl Bildt, the foreign minister of Sweden, who claims to be a great humanitarian and human rights leader, effectively vetoing EU export controls that would limit that happening because he's concerned about Ericsson's sales in that region.
Okay. Jacob, you were disagreeing with that? Or?
Oh yeah, so when you say that, could you rephrase what you said about the regimes torturing again, what you said?
I said clearly, not least if you are a resident of one of those countries, those governments are a greater threat to your life and well-being than if you live in a democracy under the rule of law.
Interesting. So I think that's a fantastic part of the myth of the West, and part of that, I think, goes to Maher Arar. If any of you are familiar with him, he was a Canadian who was exported to Syria and tortured, and that was a Western democracy supposedly upholding the liberal ideals of the West in the greatest way. And of course, the CIA rendition, which had, as I understand it, planes flying through the UK and British as well as American tyranny at every stop, it's hard to see a difference when really Gaddafi was one of our collaborators, and the UK in particular seems to have done quite a lot with that. I mean, I think
individual cases like those don't, as repugnant again as they are, don't negate the broader point that I think it's absurd to say a citizen of Kazakhstan is equally placed to a citizen of the UK or Canada or the US,
okay.
And I don't think it helps anyone's arguments to make those kind of points.
Well, I wonder what you think then about the UK and Julian Assange.
Okay, I just want to, we can come back to that, but I want to ask Karl, democracies versus authoritarian in terms of net freedom and what we've heard so far?
I think in terms of content distribution, it's like at a different level when we're talking about broadcast content getting out, people having access to web content. I think that there's definitely a difference in terms of what we would expect to see on the internet and what people in places like Iran, China, increasingly in Russia and the stands are also seeing. So I think that's coming at a completely different kind of angle really to what Jason also in terms of the actual civil liberties of that kind of repression. I think the freedom on the internet is definitely, as I mentioned earlier, the Freedom House report is saying that there are democracies as well as authoritarian regimes that are closing in on internet freedom that are less free. And some of that is actually down to the regimes and how they are blocking access to content, and others are, for example, in Mexico, where the drug barons are actually using the internet to restrict freedoms of people without the governmental involvement.
Mm-hmm. But Birgitta, what are your concerns with democracies, and is that more worrying than authoritarian? How do you see this?
Well, the more time I spent within the legal belly of the beast, I have recognized that the laws are usually not written for the interest of the people, but for the interest of those that write the loopholes in it so that they can cheat on the laws and that they have privilege. There's like a 1% of the general population that the laws can never reach to. And that for me is very troubling, and I think that we have sort of lost our democracies in many ways, and that's why I feel it is important to find ways to engage people to participate more in democracies, be it online or offline, it doesn't matter, and we can actually use the technology to involve people more. Now what I need to say, you know, in this debate between these two gentlemen is that I've been thinking, like, I've been battling a lot international corporations, let's say like Rio Tinto, Alcoa, and the IMF and Coca-Cola. They all have really pretty faces here in the West. You would never think about the crimes that they do in the developing world. You know, there is a reason why Coca-Cola had the nickname of workers' blood, because of the assassinations of this multinational corporation with their headquarters in the United States, of killing union leaders in Colombia. And most people just don't want to hear it. You know, it's like Coca-Cola is nice here in the UK, isn't it? You know, I can justify that I drink it here. McDonald's is nice here in the UK, let alone, you know, the way they have actually mutated. And actually, one of the core reasons why we have so much factory farming, and one of the main reasons why we have global warming, because that is not actually because of the cars we're driving, it's because of all the food we need to give to the factory farmed animals. So I feel that. I mean,
do you think, in terms of, I mean, the original question was democracies versus authoritarian states, and you were talking about companies, which is fine.
Soft
where does the kind
of like, look at the UK. But like, you look at the government here, or the governments now and previously, they took 1984 and thought it was an instruction manual.
But from what you've just said, how do you balance what governments are doing that are going in the wrong direction, or the power of companies and the privatization of censorship?
Well, we need to stop the revolving door. We need to sever the ties between the corporate and the state. That's the first step. So we need to know, and that's why freedom of information is so critical. We need to know who writes what bit of laws. So it doesn't matter if it's for online governance or offline governance. It all comes together. And I think one of the reasons those of us that have lived for a while online have this utopia, like you see in John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Freedom of the Internet. You know, we saw it in the early days as a way to make the offline world better. And I still believe we can. And it is critical that people actually can communicate and work together without, you know, feeling like they're a part of human trafficking. With their, like, information human trafficking. I thought it was a really good term for Facebook. And then you have, like, recent cases where Amazon actually reaches into your library and pulls out all the 1984 books because of some copyright issue. I mean, if Barnes and Nobles would knock on everybody's door that has 1984 and say, okay, I'm going to go into your bookshelf and take your book, we would say something about it. So I think that we need to get this general understanding about what is sort of legal breaches online against our privacy and rights is just as serious as when it happens in the offline world.
Okay, and just one or two last quick questions from me. I promise I'm going to open it up. The first one, you've just been talking about human rights offline world. What's different? Can we just use offline laws, offline rights, and if we've got those right and apply them to the internet, we're fine? Or
I think they're a good starting point, certainly. I think the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is signed by most countries in the world. China is one of the rare exceptions, actually, that has signed but not ratified it. And if that covenant was effectively enforced, I think that would solve some of the problems, not all. And absolutely, I'm not, by the way, claiming that we have a utopia in the UK or the US. Of course, one of the problems, and I don't want to sound mindlessly US bashing, because I'm a great admirer of the American system of governance in some ways, but the US is one of the countries that says, actually, we will not allow the ICCPR to be enforced by anybody else. You know, unlike the European countries, which have set up the European Court of Human Rights, which can and does overrule European national governments quite frequently in their behavior. The US government has said over and over, we will not allow an external party to play that role, and that's why you get things like drones and assassinations, which I agree are horrifying.
So, Jacob, online, offline rights, or is it that offline it's your fascism point?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, fascism is a very specific term, right? I mean, unless you're a subscriber of Searchlight here in the UK, you probably don't like that term and think it died out after the Second World War. So I think rather than talking about differences, we should just try to think about the similarities. And, you know, for me, I look at the internet and I see that you can tell a lot about a government by how the internet is in a country. You can tell if a country is free in a lot of ways. And for example, Freedom House does produce this report, and while I think their methodology and everything they do is extremely questionable, I do think that it is true that there are differences.
Okay,
and
so
I'm not sure
can you
how
give us your top 1 or 2 democracies and your bottom 1 or 2?
Well, I guess that would be Christiania and Iceland, and the top 2, Christiania being number 1. It's the only free anarchy in the world, and it was an autonomous region outside of the European Union in Copenhagen. It has about 800 families in it, and they're a pretty interesting place, actually. I really like that. I think if we look at this as a continuum, because it's what it is, and we see that, North Korea is on the far side,
okay,
probably.
But, and in what the generally termed democracies, who are your, at the bottom 1 or 2? Is it the States,
well, I mean, I would say the UK and the US. I mean, the big difference being there that at least we don't believe in a monarchy. But other than that, we still have white privilege, pillow fascism, and general class war.
Questions on Prince Charles's letters tonight.
Oh, why not?
Just to sort of bring in a different point of view, I was talking to someone just last Thursday who what can I say, works inside government, and was saying, oh, but look, Kirsty, comms data bill, all we're asking is that the companies hold this data, we're trying to chase a criminal, we go to them and we ask for them to give us that particular bit of information, so tracking device, whole population monitoring, nonsense. Karl, Brigitte, what do you say to that guy?
Well, I mean, I have specific data. I could respond to that. It's nonsense. There's 500,000 requests a year. The Interception of Communications Commissioner that's supposed to oversee this admits he basically can't.
Okay, nonsense. Brigitte, any other kind of criminal?
Yeah, I would actually really like Jake to go into trapwire, which I think is really, if you could explain a little bit what that is and how little the gap is between that and the new law that they're trying to pass here and in most other European countries.
Okay.
Is there a short way to do that? Because
sure. How about I disclose something never before disclosed?
Go on.
Does that sound
That's
good? I like leaking documents. How about you? So I was at Burning Man giving a talk without any pants about Tor, and afterwards I was fortunately approached by someone who I don't know, and he said, I work at Google, and I just want to let you know that one of the top users of Google Maps API is actually Trapwire. And nobody in the world knows that. So if there's a journalist with a spine here, I would encourage you to do something about what I just said. There are several I see. Thanks, Gabby. And I think it would be a fascinating thing to look into that, because what it is real-time geographic information and correlation of all of these different surveillance cameras from this service and many other private industries, all tied together to be able to measure the gait, your height, hair color, your face, all of these things to identify you and cross-correlate travel in order to determine that you are a person worth flagging, a person almost like a Scanner Darkly, if you're familiar with Philip K. Dick's utopian novels. And unfortunately, the thing about Trapwire is that it is an example of a private corporation being completely outside of the realm of freedom of information, completely outside of the realm of democracy in any way and accountability. And they are paid to build these systems, and they are given privileged access to areas of the state, and then they are used by the state exclusively. And we get to learn nothing about them, including whether or not they would do something like farm all that out to yet another corporation, this time in the United States. So that's quite a scary thing, and it's hard to go into entirely, but WikiLeaks has released much information about Trapwire, And I would really encourage people to look it up, because it is crappy in a lot of ways. That is, the technology is not quite there yet. But that's not what matters. What matters is the thought. And they are really deep into trying to build the systems that if the technology worked perfectly, you would not be able to go to the parliament and then the Ecuadorian embassy without an agent of the Metro Police knowing it was you and deciding you're a person of interest, and then maybe harassing you for whatever political affiliations they derive from the rest of the data they have on you.
Okay, so we heard a lot about surveillance, importance of freedom of information, varying degrees of outrage and
Can you imagine what this would do in like China? You know, if once they have this technology, I mean, it's like they don't understand what they're doing. They're creating Frankenstein.
I'm going to open it up to the audience. Can you keep your questions brief and say who you are? I'm starting with at the front.
I don't think there was a contradiction.
Can you tell people who you are?
James Thacker. I've dealt with 7 human rights groups. And actually, to start off with, I proposed to Ken Roth at Human Rights Watch and to Shetty at Amnesty that they adopt a total ban on all censorship, including intelligence, as a matter of principle. I don't know. I mean, I agree with you about fascism. I mean, we've got a million population of intelligence people in America, and our military is in 120 countries. But if we avoid being surveyed ourselves, how are we going to survey them? I mean, I think the First Amendment idea is an extraordinary idea, and I'd like you to answer me how on earth you would achieve First Amendment universally.
Okay.
How you want me to answer that? Well, I agree that would be a great thing. I wasn't saying that was what has happened or will happen, but I was saying many people, including John Perry Barlow in the mid-90s, when talking about the internet, claimed that this would be a wonderful, inevitable outcome of the internet, and clearly it's not, because states, democracies and authoritarian states have come up with all sorts of ways to censor the internet.
What WikiLeaks represents, though, as a principle?
I don't know that it does, and to give you a more principled answer, I think that coming back to what I said in my opening remarks about national sovereignty and democracy, people having some democratic choice over the values that they hold most dear, which are not precisely the same values across different democracies, and there are European democracies like Germany, for example, that feel very strongly that because of their history, they have laws on things like genocide denial, for example. I personally would not agree. I personally do not agree with those, but I think it's up to Germany entirely if they want to impose that, including to some extent on the German internet.
I think, Birgitta, you were saying something earlier about actually some countries can help by actually protecting content.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the the ideas behind the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative, I don't know how many of you know what that is. Okay, so basically I worked with many people in 2009 and 10 to create a set of laws that would actually make Iceland into safe haven for freedom of information. And it was originally presented, this idea was John Perry Barlow in 2008, just in the wake of the crisis. And then Julian Assange and Daniel Smith reintroduced the same idea in 2009. And I just happened to be a hacker in Parliament, so I really thought it was a brilliant idea to take the same concept as if you would have a tax haven. If I want to start a tax haven, I would go around the world to look for all the best laws in order to create secrecy. So why not apply the same to going around the world and finding all the best laws that actually function in order to have freedom of information, expression and speech in the context of the 21st century. And so we are actually, I managed to get it through the parliament by some miracle. I come from the smallest party, and I don't know how it happened, but it was unanimously accepted, this proposal, and the government is actually working on writing the laws and some really good progress with it. So if you have one country that actually set the standard, then actually the EU is now looking at these laws. There's a huge interest within some of the groups in the EU to raise the standard in the EU law package to the same level. I have a dream of having like a Scandinavian shield, because I think the Scandinavian countries like Sweden and Norway and Iceland now have a good understanding about the importance of these to bring in the laws to the 21st century.
Okay, great. I think there was a question, at the front here, and then I'll be coming to the back.
Question.
You can come in a second. I don't want to come back to all the panel for each question, so I want to bring the audience in. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's John Lubbock. I work some of the time for the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and my boss is currently in jail in Bahrain, partly for criticizing his government. I work part of the time for the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and my boss is currently in jail in Bahrain for criticizing his government on Twitter. I just wanted to ask if you see some of this a question in the same way that I do, which is that we're part of one of the main parts of the liberal democratic project is to figure out a way for our governments to be powerful enough to get stuff done without being so powerful that they can abuse us as citizens. And obviously globalization creates a whole new sort of space, a non-physical space in which governments can exert their power. And I wonder if, because I think that it's terrible, obviously, both in non-democratic countries and in the West, when governments roll back some of those powers that we have. So personally, for me, I wouldn't say that it's any worse. I think, in both kinds of countries, it's very bad when this happens, but because there are not already liberal democratic institutions existing in lots of countries, it's much more available for them to do that. And
okay,
so
your question is about powers of the state for good and for bad, in a sense, and,
yes,
and how you balance them in this modern world. Jacob, do you want to start?
I'm really sorry to hear about your boss. I did some trainings for some people in Bahrain, and one of them insisted on using Skype in order to make this call, and so we talked about this, and they decided Skype was fine, and all of the people, as I understand it, after the Skype call were all arrested because Skype, they make the deal for so-called lawful intercept, and that works as long as the rule of law is somehow fairly applied, and it's not merely rule by law or rule by a bunch of rules dictated by someone. So my heart goes out to your boss, and that's a really hard thing. And the UK and the US and a number of other so-called free countries are supporting Bahrain right now. I mean, that's a lot of blood on our hands. It's pretty fucked up. And I think it's quite clear that in Bahrain especially, because the economic interests of our states and the economics of their state line up perfectly against those activists, well, some of those people have been saved through diplomatic processes in Bahrain. Most of them have not. And they're being shot in the street and merely for walking down the road, declaring that they wish to be able to have the right to self-determination. So I feel like that's a longer answer, maybe, but the
and
situation
it's an example
is
of the online,
quite scary.
offline. But can we have some just...
Well, there's no difference, right? I mean, that's the key. There isn't a difference in authoritarian power structures. They've expanded to use the internet as a part of the support structure for oppression.
Sure. And can we just get some very quick reactions to what we could spend another hour discussing the other half of your question about? Is there, in a sense, an optimal size for the state? Do we still think we can have states that do something good for us without them also doing something bad?
Well, I mean, that's an eternal political philosophy question, but
So
I would say
the
human rights is the starting point. Meaningful human rights protection, which clearly does not exist in Bahrain.
Carl.
I think that there's clearly a blur between the online and the offline. I think one of the things that concerns me, obviously, is when Jake mentions things like the data communications bill being something that legitimizes what's already happening. Well, we've seen that the internet has built up from this sort of grassroots community. It's been built from the bottom up. And when people have been aware of violations in what would be considered offline norms, then they have risen up against that. They've protested against things like SOPA and PIPA. And
Okay, but the answer on size of state, do we still want states, governments?
Yeah, I think I'll say that's...
I'm a practical anarchist.
Give us a practical anarchist short answer on that.
I really think... No, I think that we need to take responsibilities as citizens in our democracies and understand that it's work and that we need to get out there and help co-create it, and we can use the technology to make the units smaller. I mean, the bigger the systems are, the less spaces for the individual and individual responsibility.
Jacob, do you agree with that, or your take is different?
I mean, I'm, I guess, an impractical anarchist.
Okay.
And I would say that, It doesn't really work if your democracy doesn't work, but people don't perceive it to be non-working. So, I mean, I have never voted for a thing in the U.S. that has ever passed, but maybe soon gay marriage in my state, but I'm really doubtful. I think, though, to answer your question, it's a function of the state, not the size of the state. And while I'd like to live in a world where each person had the autonomy to travel through space for all time, and to be free from anybody messing with them in their right to self-determination as long as they leave others alone, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So
but we
instead,
can get that online, you know.
Maybe we can get that online. If we have a right to anonymity, if we recognize that all people have the right to read freely and to speak freely without exception, not a single human excluded, to paraphrase Bill Hicks. The key thing is to remove exceptionalism. So, for example, when you look for who the enemies of liberty are, we must remember it is not just so-called authoritarian countries. It is the authoritarian elements within all countries and within ourselves. And so what that means is that intelligence agencies are the enemy. And they're the enemy because their job is to spy on you, to be free from accountability, to never tell you how they do it, and to tell you that you deserve it, it's for your own good, and that you had better take it and love it.
Okay, so in your ideal world, no intelligence agencies at all?
No, the People's Pine Gap instead of Pine Gap. Instead of GCHQ,
the People's Intelligence Agency.
Well, that's what WikiLeaks is. And that's exactly what the free press is supposed to be. And if the press in the United States actually functioned, we wouldn't even need a WikiLeaks. But most of the press doesn't understand technology, so they've been supplanted by people that do.
Okay, there's a ton of interesting points and questions in that, but the gentleman right at the back has been very patient, and then the one in front of him, and then we'll come.
Just a question to anyone on the panel. The United Nations Agency with governing the internet, is introducing new laws to regulate the internet a great deal more. Can I get some specific comments on that and the sort of moves in that agency, which I think are very threatening?
Did you get that question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you want to?
I think it's very difficult to know precisely what the different interests at the forthcoming meeting in Dubai in December, the World Conference on Information Technology Regulations, are manoeuvring to do. What is clear is that some of the non-Western powers, particularly Russia and China, are very unhappy with the status quo online. They think that there should be much more governmental and intergovernmental regulation of the internet than that happens today, and this is their latest attempt to make that happen. There are other venues where they've tried this before, not least the UN General Assembly. They use all sorts of subjects like cybersecurity, for example, is the current favourite. Some of those countries have proposed an international code of conduct on cybersecurity, whereas the US and its European allies are trying to argue back that we should just look for soft norms of behaviour in cyberspace rather than hard treaties. But it's just how the politics plays out at that meeting and on an ongoing basis.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Yes, Jake.
Before the First World War, it was the case that there was a special sanctity for telegraph cables, and there was no exception, as I understand it, at all for interrupting them. So the free flow of information was absolute until the British decided to enter the wars that followed in the 20th century, in which case before those wars they amended those laws to make it possible for reasons of national security exceptionalism to be able to tamper with telegraph cables. So we started free, and the British, as usual with the monarchy, marched their way straight towards this idea of compromising in exchange for security. But what we find later is that it has continued to expand far beyond just national security in a time of war. So I think we should look to the original things from the 1800s, from the telegraph cables, and to understand why it was they thought that open lines of communication could be more beneficial than specialized spying lines, where certain people get certain rights. And with mathematics, we can actually answer this guy's question as well, which is, how do we make sure that we can all freely communicate? And the answer is when we all have the right to speak freely and anonymously without discrimination, which does not mean we do not authenticate, we don't say who we are. It is that the actual system itself cannot discriminate. When we have the ability to do that, then we will be able to actually freely communicate, as opposed to if we weaken our systems and intentionally cripple them, we will end up with what happened in Greece, which is that the Prime Minister of Greece in 2004 and 2005 was wiretapped, probably by the US, who broke in and used the so-called lawful intercept systems. So by mandating these things, we actually make it more possible for people to do this, and it is extremely harmful because it shifts the risk from the military, where it is in some cases, to a telecommunications engineer who has no such training, who in the case of Greece was found hanged in his apartment. And so we move the risk into a place that's not ready for it, and no one is secure at all, so that some people get to play power, and hopefully it works out.
Can we just do a quick check-in across the panel? But you know, I'm the head of a freedom of expression organisation, but we would say, for instance, we want very few restrictions on freedom of speech, but we'd say direct and clear incitement to violence is one case, on or offline, where we might say there should be. I think you're saying, am I right, no restrictions on free speech and no role at all for the police in pursuing crimes to look at our communications on or offline?
The second part doesn't follow from the first, but
there are two questions.
So I would say that
but can we have quite short answers?
The solution to bad speech, allegedly bad speech, is more speech, and not a classist power system that gets to determine that non-democratically. So yes, free speech is a right in the UN
100%.
DHR that is quite clear. You have the right to speak freely. That doesn't mean, though, in the second question, you won't be held accountable for it. So there will be accountability. But the question is, why have prior restraint?
Exactly.
Prior restraint is an offense.
Yeah, I mean,
Birgitte?
yeah, I mean, I completely agree with him. Because once we start to go down this road in prior restraint, we get into the state where we are today. I mean, like, there's so much prior restraint on the UK media. And there are so many super injunctions and gag orders, and most of the other, countries recycle the news from the UK, and we never get to see all the news. And there are so many stories taken down. There is no proper protection on our historical records. And these are things that most people are not aware of. Like, every time you take a story offline, you are doing book burnings in every country of the world, in every library of the world. And we need to actually start to talk about the online reality with examples from the offline that we understand, to put it into terms with the myths that we are used to comprehend our daily lives.
Okay. And Karl, again, I mean, your current job and your experience in the BBC, restraints on freedom of speech, going too far, necessary to have some, blocking a lot of news?
Yeah, I mean, obviously coming from that background of news provision, then the right to actually transmit that news, to get that news into people, was something that I would have tried to protect, basically, through my work. And it's something that, working with Psiphon now, then I believe in trying to get that content into countries where it's not able to go. And I think that the right to get that out has got to be upheld. The right to freedom of speech, to freedom of information, has got to be upheld. I mean, obviously there are issues, as Jake pointed out. The press in the US doesn't understand technology, or the press in the UK, gives a different cut on the news. But I think those are all things that also need to be addressed in different areas. But the actual right to transmit that and to get that out there, I think does need to be protected.
Ian, any difference of view?
Well, my position would be close to yours, but again, coming back to what I said about people having a democratic right to choose the values that are fundamental to them, and also sometimes where they conflict, how you balance them. So Europe would have a different perspective to America, for example, on privacy, which I think is quite right. I think that some of the stuff published by the UK newspapers, let alone some of the other European newspapers, I think. In an ideal world, they would not. Whether in practice we can stop the circulation of that information anymore, I think is quite a different question, and probably it's getting harder and harder.
Okay, I'm going to a question at the front here, almost at the front. There was a gentleman here. Did you? No. Okay. Oh, woman at the front then, and then I'm coming over here, and I've got you two together.
I'd like to refer to the debate
Just
that
say
was.
Who you are.
Oh, sorry.
Or you could do it anonymously.
You can do it anonymously if you prefer to say who you are.
Okay, anonymously then. I'd like to refer to the debate before about democracy versus authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I completely disagree with the debate, in the sense that I don't think that today is democracy versus authoritarianism. I think that in a way today democracy is a prerequisite of authoritarianism, in the sense that if we look at all societies, in both democratic and authoritarian regimes, we have both democratic and authoritarian elements simultaneously. I mean, the reason why we are monitored, the reason why there are such high levels of online surveillance is because we choose to hand over our online data. So my question is, like, within the scope of this new type of system, I wouldn't like to label democracy. I don't want to label authoritarianism either. I personally label it infocracy, something completely different. Within the scope, where we have both democratic and authoritarian elements which coexist, what is the balance between online freedom, freedom of expression, and online surveillance? How can we have, I don't know, intimate internet freedom if there are such high levels of online surveillance at the same time?
Okay, so a mixture of questions there, but the one I take at the end
it's
is...
actually one specific question, like,
Go on,
how
then.
can we have more internet freedom without having more surveillance, basically?
Okay,
Because the one is linked to the other.
in what way?
In the sense that the more personal information we give up, the more personal information we put online, whether that's an article, whether it's our personal data or whatever, then the more data the more data can potentially be abused and used by third parties.
So is the fact that we're putting a huge amount of information online compromising our freedom online or not?
Well, those systems, as Jake was saying, can be designed in a way that are not so, by default, accessible to intelligence agencies and to surveillance. So I think that's one way forward is the mathematical approach. But I think at the same time, I don't agree that one follows from the other at all, because even without what I just said, you can, of course, pass laws that severely constrain the activities of your intelligence agencies and hope that they are followed.
Okay, Karl?
I think when you're talking about the amount of data online, then a lot of that is, well, some of that is data that you choose to have online in the first place, and then there are other things as well that obviously are held by corporations in the private sector. And I think that's where the issue of transparency comes in, which is that a lot of people actually don't know exactly what data is being held against, and they don't know what the privacy considerations are. I think that there's a role there for the private sector to be able to actually stand in and guide people through that. One example is when it comes to the terms of service that people could click on, don't read, and move along. I saw a site recently mentioned it was about the terms of service, tos-dr.info, I think it was, terms of service. Somebody's nodding there, I got that right. Which is basically trying to make that a bit more human, make the language of the terms of service agreements a little bit more human so that people understand what it is that they're...
Okay, but that's not going to stop there being a mountain of data there, is it? So is that mountain of data part of the problem, Birgitta, or not? That's just part of our freedom.
Can I just tell a little personal story about me, Twitter, and the Department of Justice, and why I can't travel to the United States? Well, it just really puts this into context. Okay, so when I signed up on Twitter, I did like everybody else. Anybody here that actually read the entire user agreement on Twitter?
Right.
Okay, so are you aware of that when you actually sign it, or at least when I did, that in it there is a sentence that says that that it might change, and it won't even, according to the user agreement that I signed, the U.S. Department of Justice should not have been able to do what they did. So what they did was, because I volunteered for WikiLeaks, is that they put forward a secret order to Twitter demanding that they would hand over my personal information without my knowledge. And I'm not talking about the tweets, I'm talking about the messages, the IP numbers, bank statements for some reason, which led us to believe that this was actually a form letter they sent to more companies than just Twitter. And I was not the only one that received a letter from Twitter. Jacob happened to be in Iceland on a holiday, stuck in a snow mountain somewhere, and Rob Congrep. We all got the same letter, and Private Bradley Manning as well, but he happened to be in a prison, so he wasn't doing a lot of tweets or private messaging. So what it meant is that in the first ruling, I think it was in the first ruling, and we have slight difficulties in discussing this because of the weirdness of the U.S. Justice system. So like if you say something, like I can say a lot, but I'm afraid that I might compromise Jake because he lives in it, in the land of the free.
Land of the free refill.
Anyway, So what the judge actually did was that he overruled in the sense that we as individuals don't have the right to look after our backs. We have to rely on the social media to look after our backs. So, like, to answer your question, the more stuff we put online, and we don't have, we can't rely on ourselves. We have to trust these massive corporations to look after our backs. We are compromising our privacy. It's obvious. How to tackle it, I don't have an answer to that. I mean, Jake and some other people were doing like a freedom box, and I'm still waiting for mine. I promised to set it up in the Icelandic Parliament, so I'm waiting.
Jacob, you.
Well, I guess, I think we should probably consider if anyone would like to hear about the Twitter case, because that is in itself its own question. And I would like to answer the other question, but maybe we could see a show of hands. Is anyone interested in hearing about the Twitter case that we're involved in at all? So maybe we could call that a meta question. Could we call that a meta question and maybe talk about that?
Yes, and whichever way around you want. Yes?
All right, so to answer the other question, I think hope isn't really a good strategy when dealing with intelligence agencies. The way that I look at this is that it is usually the case that when I talk about the things that I've just said, people expect me to be struck dead by lightning, or like Lushenko poisoned with polonium. And I think after he was here, right? 2 days later. Well, anyone want to go for sushi? Tempt fate, right? I think that the solution here is a distinction which we could call privacy by design. So imagine that you have a choice between giving your data to some people, and they promise they won't give it up, and then, oh shit, they have to give it up because they're actually, required to by law, or maybe because they have an insider that leaks it. So they say, well, we promise it'll only go there. Well, the data's already transferred, so what good does that promise? So instead, I think we should try to have some fundamental core principles, which we have established generally, and we try to make sure that these principles apply everywhere. So this idea of, worrying about erasing history, right, that you're talking about. I think it should not be possible for people to order the takedown of things. That doesn't mean it should be the forced preservation of history, but to say that we should be able to, for libel reasons, make a printing press reverse itself, to uninvent the printing press, essentially, because the web just happens to work without paper. It allows for an authoritarian expansion that we didn't have with the printing press. You can't unprint books. You can try to burn them, but it's bad PR. And so I think we have to embrace some positive rights, such as the fundamental right to anonymity, freedom from suspicion, freedom from surveillance, and to not interfere with objective reality, which is to say if the BBC publishes a thing and the Iranians block access to it, that's a trade issue. They're interfering with this. They should treat it as a trade issue. They should make sure that when that is happening, it's taken to the diplomatic places where it has always been for those particular kinds of issues. And people will find their own way to get past those filters in many cases. But the key thing is that if we are going to have states, which we will, it seems quite inevitable, that we will make sure that they actually do positive things. And so instead of hoping intelligence agencies won't spy on us, since we clearly will not get rid of them anytime soon, we just have to have effective oversight and transparency of the institution while maintaining individual personal privacy with mathematics and strong cryptography and free software for freedom.
Would one of your principles, Ian, be no surveillance or very low surveillance?
Well, very low. I would not. I mean, I don't know if Jacob, if this is as far, you would go this far in saying no surveillance under any circumstances whatsoever, or you're making a distinction between mass surveillance versus very targeted surveillance. So, for example, if a relative of mine had been kidnapped, yes, I would want the police to be intercepting the calls of the people that were demanding a ransom from me.
What would you say to waking up in the middle of the night with two people with night vision goggles watching you sleep in the middle of the night because they use those same powers to spy on my partner? She's in the audience, so think carefully.
Well, I don't have to think carefully because I think it's an absurd comparison.
No, it's not, because the same
I think we're just in a different universe in discussing these things.
Yes,
I'm a mild anarchist. I'm not. I think the state has some functions.
How are you providing a solution to that? How are you providing a solution to that problem? Because you're saying you want that when there's a kidnapping.
Yes.
But what will we do when it turns out that you will never experience a kidnapping? And I have experienced what I just said.
But some people have
I don't think
experienced
that
kidnapping.
has anything to do with this
I
discussion.
think, isn't the question, hang on, isn't the question here between you and the difference, because let's try and illuminate it a bit, is about whether you can design a law and hold the state or the powers to account in such a way that it targets things that we might be able to agree are a problem and not be used in other ways. You're saying that's impossible.
What I'm saying is, I have not heard someone propose a thing that does that. And there is this basic belief that somehow, because they may do something good, that means that they won't abuse it, or if they abuse it, it is somehow worth it. And that is an appeal to emotion which lacks data. And I would say that it's not about being an anarchist or not. It's about being realistic. There are people who are under the thumb of the state and who are crushed by that, which is generally considered legitimate, except in that case. And this is the problem. We must come up with solutions to that. And when we build things like solving kidnapping, allegedly, well, I'd like to see exactly, because the US argued in the 1990s that kidnapping was why they needed CALIA. Well, Susan Lando did the research and found that there was something like 40 or so related wiretappings during that era, and the actual number of wiretappings was in the hundreds of thousands over that period for things unrelated to kidnappings. So is it worth destroying the possible civil liberties of 250,000 people
All right.
for that?
Can we have a quick response from Ian? But I've got at least 3 more questions and more who'd like to come
promise
in,
you I
so.
wasn't trying to justify CALIA, and I think the argument's just flowing, going all over the place. Of course you need things in place that will control effectively the exercise of these very invasive powers. And I'm not saying that we have them today, certainly not in the UK, but effective requiring judicial warrants, for example, which for some of these powers to be exercised you do need in the US. I know in many cases not. For very few circumstances in the UK, and I think that's a real problem with the UK regime.
What, for not needing judicial warrants?
Yeah.
Okay, we could spend the last 10 minutes on this, but I've got a lot of questions and I've got your Meta Twitter questions. I'm going to take a couple at a time, starting with the gentleman at the front, then we'll go here, then we'll get some replies and fit in 2 at the back. So, and everyone be short, can you? Because we're running out of time.
I'll try my best.
Sorry.
I'm Jeremy Zimmerman, co-founder and spokesperson for citizen organization La Quadrature du Net. I think that this battle here is definitely political, which in the end amounts to who will shout the louder. Some of the panelists argued about whether it would be the governments or the corporations that would be the enemy. I'm very much afraid that we are facing an alliance between global corporations and governments and political forces together. And this may be very close to Jake's definition of fascism, actually. On the other hand, what we see is this global network public sphere, that is the internet, which is a global space for equality of chances, for potentiality of participation. And this is why I strongly disagree with Ian's version of a German internet that would be sovereign. I think this doesn't exist.
Okay.
We have, I'm getting there. We have strong examples. In the past where this global network public sphere achieved major political results over ACTA, over net censorship in Germany, over SOPA and PIPA in the US, and so on. My question to the panelists, and Jake answered some of it already. What are the bricks? What are the political elements and objectives that we are looking for to secure our global common good, that is this network public sphere? There's cryptography, free software. What are the political objectives and bricks?
That's very clear. Great question, but I'm going to take the question at the front here too, and then toss it back to the panel and try and fit in 1 or 2 more questions.
Okay, I'll try to be brief too. Natalia Gallen, just a postdoc. I wonder whether I'm defining this correctly. The internet is an extension of your mind. And what we're trying to do is identify whether you have a guilty mind or not, because your actions, when they manifest themselves in the real world, can cause a lot of damage. So that's the surveillance is a preemptive course of action. And I wonder whether then what you're trying to say with, saying mathematics and applying cryptography and blah, blah, to secure your own person and reveal as much data as you like, is basically the analog of carrying around a gun on the street to protect yourself from the police in case they come to get you.
I like your analogy from the 1990s.
We've got it in. Okay, so
I'll see you and raise you the same arguments we had then.
Okay, let's just start with very short answers, if you can, please, panel. What are the bricks we need for a secure global common space of the internet? Your top sort of 1 or 2 Snapshot bricks.
Well, we, Jake and friends, I was minorly involved in the 90s when I was more of a geek than I am now, have been, they're not complicated actually. As you know, Jeremy, I don't think the problem is the lack of tools or the lack of software, it's the lack of will of people to use things like PGP. I mean, who in the audience has sent or received an encrypted email message this month? Which is a lot more than a standard audience. Usually it would just be one or two at most. So I think encouraging people to actually use the tools that already exist, I think is most important. But secondly, on your second point, Jeremy, as much as I agree with you and Jake that the answer to bad speech is more speech, that is not the view of many perfectly well-intentioned Democrats who feel very strongly about human rights in many European countries. And I don't think it's right for us to impose our perspective on those people.
Okay. Karl, your top 1 or 2 bricks.
Well, I'd just like to comment on something that Ian just said, which is about encouraging people to use tools that already exist. I mean, in this audience, obviously, we've got a large number of people who know what these tools are, who know how to use them, who have used them. But when you talk about the mass population, who is it that should be encouraging people to use these tools? How do you get that message to them? It's again, it's an age-old question, but
how do you get people to do what's possible? Birgitta, your top 1 or 2 bricks. I think you've already mentioned some of them, but
yeah. Well, you know, actually, I don't know if it's true, but there's been circulating this story that Mussolini originally called fascism corpocracy, the perfect marriage between the corporate and the state. Whether or not he did, and then he changed it to fascism, it probably sounded better. But you know, this is one of the big problems, is that this unholy matrimony between the corporate and the state. So I think one of the tools is to really sever the ties between these two. And I think that people are too, ready to look through and think that they're good intentions because they're pretty faces in the West. And another one is actually one of the reasons.
Very short, we're running out of time.
So one of the reasons we started to do the Icelandic Modern Media Initiative was to make something like WikiLeaks redundant. But until we have that in place, we need many, many more WikiLeaks.
Okay. Jacob.
That would be a tool.
Well, I guess I would say that I can't disagree more with this notion of relative human rights. In particular, I mean, imagine that there's a country in which, let's say, Morocco, and just hypothetically, women on waves were to show up and say that women have the right to choose over their own body. Why is it that a state should be able to use whatever little legitimacy it might have to be able to restrict that individual's ability to defect from that choice in a very personal way? Right? I think, for example, you would probably not argue that the state should be able to impose that censorship on her choice. Why should they be able to do that for all of our speech? That is a threat to democracy itself, just like that is a threat to a woman's autonomy. And I would say that we should not tolerate a threat to anyone's autonomy, even if it is slightly offensive that someone has made a choice differently.
Okay. And can we have a comment maybe from you, Birgitta, and Karl, to the second question we had about is it like using a gun to protect yourself from the police?
No, I don't experience that. I experience the internet a little bit more like manifestation of the collective consciousness, because I really feel that it is nearly sacred how you can actually connect with people that are like-minded. That's why everything is happening so quickly, and that's why there is so much development. And I have never, and I have virtually lived there since '95, every day, increasingly more. And I just don't, I don't connect with this. Do you call it? What do you call what you said?
Analogy.
Yeah, analogy.
All right. Actually, Karl, I'm gonna come back to you, but we're almost out of time. Lots more questions, but I think you'll have to grab the panel afterwards. I'm very conscious we've got a very big show of hands on the Meta Twitter question. Jacob, do you want to start very short on that? A Meta short answer to the.
Sure. In the United States, there's a modern version of the counterintelligence programs. Similar to what Richard Nixon was running. It has been happening, at least for the last decade, quite clearly. You know, they say green is the new red. Well, WikiLeaks is the new green. And so as it just so happens, people that are associated with WikiLeaks have been targeted quite extensively. And so this is a threat on freedom of association, including the association of people who have nothing to do with WikiLeaks but are 1 or 2 degrees away. Mm-hmm. So Birgitta and I were both targeted with what are called 2703D orders. That's 18 U.S.C. 2703. Got that? Subsection D. And what that is it's an administrative subpoena. It has a lower bar than a search warrant. And what that means is that some people decided they wanted what is called metadata, that is data, about ourselves and about our data. And they decided that they would send it to Twitter, and they had with it a gag. Now, Twitter happened to fight in court, and they happened to fight in court and win unsealing this, which meant that I was able to retain counsel thanks to pro bono legal service. Kecker and Van Ness, Brigida and Ropp were able to get counsel with the EFF and the ACLU. And what we have been doing for the last, I guess, years now, several years, is we've been fighting and consistently losing. And we have been losing because of a thing that is called the Stored Communications Act in the United States, but also because of a number of other issues of precedent, such as the Patriot Act, Section 215, which has a secret interpretation that the public is not allowed to know, by the way. So there's just an entire
secret. Like, in the last leg of it is just to get information about which other companies have been forced to hand over our data. I think there are like 3 or 4 or something.
Well, so what happened in the case of our data?
Sorry, we're going to have to bring it to
Sure. In the case of our data, what happened is that they were able to force the production of the data despite the fact that we are still in court. In 2 days, we have another hearing, as I understand it. And that is, in this case, to rule on what is called the secrecy of the docket issue. And what this means is that the court has been issuing many, many, many orders like this one. This is merely the only one we were allowed to find out about. The exception being that the Wall Street Journal wrote that this happened with Google and my ISP, Sonic.net, as well, so the 3. But they're not the only 3. The problem is that the judiciary has decided that they have even made an order should be kept secret from even their own records. So we lost the part where we say don't give up our data. Metadata in aggregate is content. That's lost. They've got the data. We're still appealing. We're no longer appealing on that data, though, because they've decided that that's fair game.
Okay, can you?
Almost. It's very complicated. And
I'm sure it is, but we're actually out of time.
I believe it. Almost there. Almost there. So the secrecy of the docket issue, which is a very serious problem, if we lose this, it means that the judiciary will not be able to be held to account for having even issued an order. And we do not know, the case that we have, we do not know how far it spreads. We only know very little about these things because it's all under seal. And so those things, we can't actually talk about some of the other things because I, at least, would be jailed for talking about the possibility that there are potentially things that we are gagged for talking about, in a hypothetical sense.
I think.
Well, if you want to know more about this, you can go to the EFF.org website.
Great, because I think, it's been an extraordinary discussion. I'm aware there's a ton more questions. We could easily have done it at 3 hours, not an hour and a half, I suspect. And
any chance we could keep going?
I think you can keep going in the bar downstairs afterwards. I think it just shows us how many issues there are, and it's quite intriguing to have seen where there's a lot of agreement and where we're pulling out really fundamental differences of view politically. We are completely out of time. I'm going to do that crass thing at the end, but I'm going to do it anyway, of say on a 0 scale from 10 to 0 of how good or bad things are now, where 10 is completely free and 0 is disaster. Ian, out of 10?
I think that would be a meaningless oversimplification.
Okay, thank you. Not, Karl? Number?
I can't just give a number.
No, right. Birgit, to be brave, give us a number.
I'm not an oracle, but I have no idea, to be honest.
You have no idea, Jake?
If you're not Bradley Manning or Julian Assange, we still have, I think, a chance to make things a lot better. And it's going to get a lot worse as long as people keep compromising. So we need to stop compromising.
Okay, so completely defeating panel. Thank you very much indeed.